All right, welcome back to WCHS, ladies and gentlemen. And in social studies, we have two writing assignments. We have what I refer to as the A1, and logically the second one would be called the A2. The first half of this month, we've been looking at the A1, and today we're going to transition and begin to look at the A2. So to that end, there's a handout at the back I asked you to grab. I'm going to go over the handout with you, and in order to make it more meaningful, I'm going to have the essay prompt that we're going to be looking at. The first essay will be handed in. It's attached to the handout as well. So that when we go over the steps today, we can go over them with the first A2 in mind. So, the nice thing about this handout and about this assignment is it's very similar to the A1. So let's take a look at it. It's also on Google Classroom. So you can see that the first step in an A2 is to establish the problem. And that is a similar thing that we do to interpret sources. So instead of interpreting them, we're analyzing them now, but there's a lot of overlapping skills or tools that we use for both. So we're going to look at the source now and see if we can establish the problem that inspired the source. So skipping ahead to the source, well, that didn't translate well on the page. It's definitely not divided like that in the actual document. Skipping ahead to the source, we can see it is only through interdependence that we can create the global unity necessary to overcome our common challenges. But we must also realize that not all challenges are equal. Overcoming scarcity is a more immediate challenge and is the protection of diversity. So step one is to try to identify what is the problem that inspired the source. In this source, what's the problem? What is the problem in that source? Again, the source is also in your handout. I saw your handout. Yeah?
Scarcity.
So, it definitely says scarcity is a problem, right? But we must also realize that all challenges are equal. Overcoming scarcity, right, is a more immediate challenge. So, underneath problem, scarcity is fitting underneath that umbrella. Scarcity is one of the problems we need to deal with. And we'll come back to that term scarcity. Is there any other language in the source that tells us what the problems are? It is only through interdependence that we can create the global unity necessary to overcome our common challenges. But we must also realize that not all challenges are equal. Overcoming scarcity is a more immediate challenge than is the protection of diversity. So what's the big umbrella of problems referred to as in this source? No. Not interdependence. It's the problems in the source. Yeah?
Political marginalization.
Well, I don't see that term here, so we're just trying to find some terms in the source right now. Yeah?
Like the protection of diversity.
That's
more
yeah. So we have scarcity and we have the protection of diversity. These are problems, but there's a bigger term that describes both of them. Common challenges. So the inspiration behind the source is finding a path to address our common challenges. Somewhere in your analysis of your essay, and your analysis is not an introduction for an essay, it's so much more, but it is your first paragraph of an essay that takes part of an introduction, but it's going to be doing more than that because you have to analyze the source that you will be responding to. And key to analyzing a source is to say, this source is inspired by something. This source is inspired by a problem, right? It wants us to address our common challenges. So the inspiration behind this source is a desire to address common challenges. Common challenges like overcoming scarcity, common challenges like protection of diversity. But both overcoming scarcity and protection of diversity, both of those fit underneath this problem of common challenges. So as we move forward in this course, we need you to look for common challenges. Every day I want you to be thinking, did we come across a new common challenge today that I can fit into my essay? Now, before we unpack the overcoming scarcity and protection of diversity that is on the page, let's go back to related issue 1, the unit that we've just finished. Does the term common challenges fit with related issue 1? Did we see any common challenges for the planet? Within that unit we just finished, what were the common challenges? Thought I saw your hand going up. No. Thought I saw one of these. It was like, but no, that hand's not going up. So, within related issue 1, did we see any common challenges? And what would be the biggest common challenge that we saw? Did we talk about scarcity in related issue 1? Have we studied scarcity this year? No. So, related issue 1 was globalization, interconnectedness of mankind, and its impact on identity. Did we see a common challenge? What was it?
Cultural globalization.
Cultural globalization is the dimension where we impact culturally. Cultural globalization, not a problem. It's an arena. Economic globalization is an arena, political, social, cultural, religious. These are all arenas. What might be a bad thing happening within the arena of cultural globalization? Why might somebody look in there and say, oh, I don't want to globalize. This is going to happen. Yeah? Homogenization. So this is now where we say the word homogenization. So although not announced on the page, one example of a common challenge is cultural homogenization that we saw in related issue 1. Another example might be assimilation that we referred to in related issue 1. That doesn't fit under scarcity, but is there any language on the page that does allow us to talk about it? And what is that language? Just gonna do some lunges up here. What is the language on this page that allows us to talk about cultural homogenization and assimilation? Yes. Global unity. That definitely allows us to talk about globalization. Yeah? Diversity. Absolutely. So on the page where it says protection of diversity, there's an opportunity for us to say that one of the values of this source is that it values a world where there isn't assimilation. It values resistance to assimilation. It values protection of diverse cultures. Diversity can be measured culturally. It can be measured ecologically as well. So we'll come back to the term diversity in related issues 3 and 4. But so far for this course, the part of the essay that you could write would be the part about protection of diversity when different cultures interconnect. So we're still looking at the problem, and we do see that they're suggesting that overcoming scarcity is more immediate challenge than its protection of diversity. What does scarcity look like? Even though we haven't studied it yet, you should have seen the term last year in grade 9. What does scarcity look like in the global village? Yes? Scarcity of resources, right? So we have stuff called scarce resources or finite resources. This essay will give us a chance to talk about finite resources like oil. But you also said for, did you say impoverished people?
I said underprivileged.
Underprivileged, impoverished people. So another connection to the global village here where it says overcoming scarcity is a more immediate challenge. We talk about underprivileged or impoverished people. So the first step we need to do is find out what is the problem on the page. Very similar to an IS, right? Interpretation of source. Now we're analyzing the source. Even in related, or in assignment 1, we have to say there's a problem that inspired the source. Here there's a problem. There's always going to be a problem in an A2, and the problem is common challenges. That's so vague. We need to be more specific. More specifically, it says that we have the need to overcome scarcity, and we have the need to protect diversity. And it's saying that we need to overcome scarcity first. What word on the page says that we need to overcome scarcity first? Yes?
It's a more immediate challenge.
It's a more immediate challenge. So when the source suggests that scarcity is a more immediate challenge, it's prioritizing our common challenges. It's saying we have to address this one first. Now, why? Why might they say that? Is there an observable phenomenon? Is there something that we could allude to that isn't explicitly said on the page? But we can infer that when they say it's an immediate challenge, it's this that they're thinking about. So what we're going to do is try to give an example of scarcity so extreme that people would agree we have to deal with that, and then we'll deal with diversity issues. So what's an extreme version of people living in scarcity? What does that look like? Yes?
Third world countries.
Third world countries, and what about them?
With the fact that people's resources are exploited to the point that they don't have money to live. Like they don't have homes.
Right?
They don't have food. They don't have clean water.
Exactly. So taken to an extreme, scarcity can be seen as homelessness, lack of food and water. What happens when people don't have homes, food, and water? They die. So even though it's not explicitly stated, we can infer that when they say scarcity is an immediate challenge, that's an allusion to the reality that people die when they don't have food and water. See what I'm doing there? I'm analyzing. I'm taking the language on the page and I'm finding a perspective. So this source is inspired by someone who's observing scarcity. So extreme that it is causing death. That's what's inspired this source. What do we call it when there's death at either a micro or macro level because of scarcity? What are some attached words that we could use to describe that? At a micro level, at an individual level, if Russ McBride's living in scarcity, homeless and living on the streets in Edmonton or in Wetaskiwin here, and I don't have enough food and I die. I'm living in poverty. So at a micro level, this scarcity could be seen as extreme poverty. At a macro level, what do you call it when millions of people living in the same country have a sudden scarcity? That suddenly, in France, or in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, yes?
Humanitarian crisis.
It's a humanitarian crisis, right? So you could argue it's still a crisis for humanity when we have people dying on our streets of poverty. But when you have millions, that becomes a humanitarian crisis because you have a shortage of food. What do we call a shortage of food? One of them caused the French Revolution because there wasn't enough bread. We've seen shortages in countries cause other revolutions.
Famine.
This is a famine. So at a macro level, we have famines that, if left unaddressed, could cause revolutions. But they will definitely cause millions of deaths. So that's the issue, right? So step one, you can see our steps are on that list. Step one, we want to see what inspired the source. What's the problem, right? So up here it says, link the problem, issue, and possible inspiration, and significance, and if left unaddressed. we're answering these things right now. In our discussion, we've been answering. Oh, what a fool this guy is. In our discussion, we've been answering these things. Can you see how we've unpacked? This is the problem. Common challenges. Possible inspiration. Well, at a macro level, it could be a famine. At a micro level, it could be extreme poverty in the streets, like homelessness. Either way, it's a humanitarian or at least a crisis for humanity. The significance of the language is things like immediate, right? This is an immediate challenge. If left unaddressed, we know that extreme poverty leads to death. This is where you could end up researching some unfortunate statistics. You know, a child every 5 seconds dies because of poverty. Because of lack of clean water, lack of food. If left unaddressed, what does it lead to? It leads to death. At a global level, if famine and poverty are left unaddressed, it could lead to, at a global level, more than just the death of one child every 5 seconds. This could become, one of those waves that ends up causing hundreds of millions or even billions of deaths. But we'll get to that. Can we check off this part of the assignment? We found a problem, some possible inspirations. We looked at the key language to identify the problem and the tone. Well, we never talked about tone. Let's see if we can see any tone. If I said that there's a word in there that shows me that there's an urgent tone, that the urgency is attached to one of the words, which is the word? Yes? Immediate, right? By the use of the word immediate, the voice behind the source is presenting a tone of urgency. We have to do this now. It's immediate. You stop. You know what? Diversity is important too. We'll get to that. But we got this other stuff we need to take care of first. Every 5 seconds, people are dying. That's the urgent stuff. Now, what would I say if I also said there's another tone here, that there's an absolute tone? This is where I would suggest to you that it's kind of like we're Doctor Strange, and we're looking at all the possible scenarios of defeating Thanos, and we're like, wow, there's one. What word up here is kind of like Doctor Strange saying, there's like one path here. Yes? Interdependence. And before that, that is the one path. The word is only. It's only through interdependence. By saying there's only through interdependence, there's an absolute devotion to one path. And this is the only way to solve the problem. So the source is not saying there's multiple ways to solve the problem. They're saying there's one way. One way. And that gets us to the solution part of the assignment. So now that we've talked about the problem, logically, next up we're going to talk about, well, what is the solution to the problem? And the solution to the problem is the ideological perspective. So the problem of the source is kind of like the theme that we're going to be writing an essay on. Common challenges. Now, it should be said before we get into the ideological perspective, we do need to connect that problem to the theme of the course, right? Now, the theme of this course is globalization. I think we can see a connection with the problem of globalization. So when we look at the ideological perspective, I think we're going to be able to find a perspective that comes back to globalization. So next up, when we look at a solution, we want to see if there's any key language on the page that highlights the solution. So what is the solution provided by this source? Yes? Global unity, right? So global unity is the solution. This is what we need. To get to global unity, how are we going to achieve that? So overcoming common challenges is our problem. We're going to do that through global unity, and we'll get unity by doing something else. Through interdependence. So interdependence is the solution, because it's going to provide us the unity to overcome the problem. So the source offers interdependence as the solution to the problem. How does that connect to globalization? Is that rejecting globalization? Is it reflecting globalization? Is it challenging globalization? Is it celebrating globalization? How does interdependence connect to globalization? Yes?
It's celebrating
It what?
it. It's celebrating it.
It's celebrating it. So by offering interdependence as a solution to our common challenge, it is celebrating globalization as our only path to overcoming them. This is a globalist perspective. So our goal is to find an ideological perspective and attach it to the theme of the course, which is globalization. We looked at the language. We found the solution of interdependence, and in that solution we have the perspective. Perspective is the globalist perspective. Because it's saying we must become interdependent in order to address these common issues. Now, while we're talking about globalization, it could be said that the common issues were caused by globalization. So we might get to that later, right? So thinking actively and critically, you might be saying, oh, but didn't globalization create these problems? Maybe we'll come back to that. Or thinking actively and critically, you might be saying, we have more problems than just scarcity and diversity. We'll come back to that. But for now, we have this idea that interdependence is a solution to the problem of common challenges. So next step. Connect these values to the theme of the course. The values is pro-globalism. We said that it celebrates the theme of the course. Now, who's the audience? Who might be the audience? If the speaker says it is only through interdependence that we will create the global unity necessary to overcome our common challenges, but we must also realize that not all challenges are equal. Overcoming scarcity is a more immediate challenge than is the protection of diversity. If the speaker said that, who are they likely saying it to? Who's going to be able to create this interdependence and unity? Who's in the audience? Is this the speaker saying it to 7.8 billion people? Is this the speaker going on a tour of third world countries, developing or undeveloped countries, and talking to the people in the villages? Is this the speaker talking to the leaders of the top 500 corporations in America? Is this the speaker talking to politicians, religious leaders, people on a campaign trail? Who's the likely audience that can actually do this? Yes? Might be those facing scarcity, saying, you know what, I'm in this with you, right? Saying that I can see your scarcity and I have a solution. So one part of the audience could be that the speaker is speaking to those in scarcity and offering them some hope. Wow, that's insightful. I never thought of that. That's good. Well done. So that's one possible audience. Who else could they be speaking to? Politicians. Why would it be more effective to talk to 200 politicians than, yeah?
Because they have more power than those who face scarcity. They can put in regulations that change the way that we live.
Yeah, so the Canadian Prime Minister, today it's Prime Minister Trudeau, tomorrow it may or may not be. It is election day in Canada. But the government of Canada can create legislation that can guide us. That's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be leaders. That's what a prime minister is supposed to do, is lead a country. Or a premier, not hide somewhere while there's, a public health crisis. What they're meant to do is lead us. They can lead us by creating legislation. They can lead us by creating initiatives, by regulating our behavior, both economic and social behavior, towards our more desirable outcome. So political leaders are in a position through legislation and regulation to shape the end, right? So it could be a political leader. If he's talking to economic leaders, who's he talking to? And I say he because I made the source, and I'm a he. So if he's talking to economic leaders, then who's he talking to? But who? Am I talking to the guy who owns Fast Gas in Millet? Because I love that guy. We talk all the time. Is he going to be able to change the world like this? So if I could sit certain people down, who am I sitting down? Yes?
Like the top 10 like billionaires or like those who
Yeah.
have the biggest businesses.
So if I'm really trying to do this, I'm going to need to get that 1% on my side, even the 0.01%. I should be talking to those, not only just the billionaires, but people that are worth tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. So Elon Musk might be a guy to talk about. Elon wants to have a plan B for the planet, right? Like in case there's an asteroid that comes, we need to have some people on Mars. So Elon's already a futurist. He's already trying to think about our future and ensuring the survival of our species. He's a guy that I need to talk to about this. I'd be like, you know what, Elon? Not to take away from that Mars passion of yours, that's cool. We've got some work to do here on the planet. You know, you are innovative, you're charismatic, and you're basically either Tony Stark or maybe you're Bruce Wayne, because you're like worth $100+ billion. And I think you could be a part of the solution. I'm going to phone people up like that and see if I can get them on board, because they have the power of influence in the marketplace through innovation, but also through their own attractive charisma, right? So that's my audience. That's who I'm speaking to. We elaborated on some of the key big rocks, but did we elaborate on all of them, right? So this is where, before I move on, I want to make sure that, have I talked about the significance of the language? So if this was a sheet of paper like you have, I might circle things like it is only, and I'm going to circle only, and I'm like, okay. I mentioned that the word only had a tone, so check mark, I talked about that. It is only through interdependence. Yes, I talked about interdependence and connected it to globalization. We're good there. That we can create the global unity. So somewhere in my paper, I'm going to want to talk about global unity. To overcome our common challenges. So even though the source talks about common challenges generally as scarcity and protection of diversity, I think there's opportunity to talk about what did the source omit. So I might want to come back to that. We must all realize that all challenges are created equal, overcoming scarcity. So I'm going to need to define scarcity, right? I need to make sure that somewhere in my paper I'm going to talk about what is scarcity. So obviously having a finite amount of something. Finite amount of oil, why is that significant? Finite amount of clean water, why is that significant? So before I move on, I want to make sure I identify the big rocks and that I build my essay around them. And the other big rock is this idea of immediate and protection of diversity. So before I move on, I went back, I looked at the big rocks to see if there's any more I could talk about. But now I think it's logical to talk about the division of society. So the division of society means, much like in the A1, some people would agree with the perspective and some people would disagree. And I think that, one of the opportunities here is to highlight a little bit more about how you understand the perspective. So I'm going to introduce you to a philosopher named Maslow. His name's on the board over there. Maslow and his theory of a hierarchy of needs is being reflected in the ideological perspective being presented. So Maslow and his hierarchy of needs is being reflected here. So Maslow has this theory that we have to address certain needs first. Physiological, safety. We have to address these physical needs first, like clean water, food, and shelter, before we can address other needs like esteem and ultimately achieve self-actualization. So when the source prioritizes scarcity issues before diversity issues is reflecting Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That some needs are more immediate, like physiological needs. So when we talk about the division of society and we want to say proponents, a proponent of the source is the psychologist Abraham Maslow, as he presented a hierarchy of needs. And when he presented a hierarchy of needs, he said that we cannot achieve self-actualization. We cannot address things like diversity if we're living in hunger. Even though he didn't use those terms, it's the same theme that we're seeing here in the solution. So the next part of the analysis of source is begin to talk about the division of society. And within that division of society, you'd have proponents like Maslow, who agrees that some needs must be addressed first, and the most immediate are the physiological ones, based upon the scarcity of things like food and water and shelter. And then we can deal with other issues like diversity issues. Who might be an opponent of the source? Who might say that the source is missing something? Some of the source's opponents might be saying that there's a serious omission. There's an oversimplification, or there's a bias, right? Yes?
They might argue that since it's pro-globalist, they're ignoring that maybe globalization is the source of these problems, like with the resource curse, perhaps.
100%. So, being that the source is taking a pro-globalist perspective, anti-globalists would say that it's globalization that actually created these problems. So from the voice of opposition, anti-globalists would attack the pro-globalist perspective and say that it's ignoring the fact that globalization created the problems. So another key part of your essay will be this division of society. Maslow agrees that we must prioritize our needs, take care of those scarce ones first that are critical to our survival. This one is saying, well, you know what? Your pro-globalist perspective in terms of how to address the needs is based upon a pretty critical false assumption that globalization didn't create these problems in the first place. Any more assumptions? Assumption that you're going to be able to do what? It's assuming that interdependence is going to create. There's a big assumption here that interdependence is the path to something. And what is the path to? Global unity. Right? Equality is cool too, but I'm going to say global unity. So the assumption of the source is that interdependence will create global unity. Interdependence means we rely on each other. It's one of the outcomes of globalization. When we interconnect, we become interdependent. Are we globalized today? Yes. Do we have global unity today? No. Do we have any observable evidence that we lack global unity? Remember when we looked at sources in related issue 1, and we looked at whaling. How do we know that we don't have consensus in terms of saving the whales? Because Norway, Japan, Canada, we still whale. The world can say, whales are endangered, let's not whale. Some of the countries that even signed those agreements are still whaling. Do we have any other examples that we lack consensus? We have climate change initiatives, like the Paris Peace Accords, Paris protocols, right? Not the Paris Peace Accords, Paris protocols, climate protocols. And you have near consensus among countries in the world, except then you have major countries that sit out like the United States and say, oh, we're going to opt out. As long as you have countries opting out, you don't have consensus. And if they're common challenges, you need consensus. So one of the simple assumptions of the source is that interdependence will create consensus. And the reality is we've never seen that historically. There's no historical precedent that we can become that interdependent and build unity at that level. We have a mechanism in place today called the UN. And the UN has been unable to deal with these common challenges. At the beginning of the millennium, they created the UN Millennium Goals. Some of them they have dealt with. Many of them they haven't. And new ones have arisen. Some people criticize the UN as being too slow to change. So the voice of opposition would say that globalization created the problems, or that that's a pretty simple assumption that interdependence is going to create unity. But let's even extend that for a little bit and say, you know what? Let's assume that interdependence can create unity. There's another point of division here. They didn't tell us how to achieve global interdependence. So you said interdependence will create unity, and let's assume that you're right. How do we achieve interdependence? What does that look like? Are we going to become interdependent under a global democracy or a global authoritarian state? There's more than one model of political structure out there. Which one will create interdependence? Will interdependence be the byproduct of a free market or a centrally planned economy? Put simply, is this source promoting capitalism and democracy, or is it promoting socialism and dictatorship? So at the end of related issue 2, we're going to take an opportunity to go back to some grade 9, and we're going to study the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and give you an opportunity to breathe that into this essay. After you do the division of society part of your analysis, logically then it's like, and this is what I think. This is what the source thinks, the ideological perspective. This is what proponents of it would say, Maslow. This is what opponents would say, anti-globalists, or people that say that these are simple assumptions. Now this is what I say. That's your thesis. This is what I say. Your thesis will work on thesis statements in another class. That's how the analysis paragraph ends. At this time, you should be able to use a Chromebook, and I'm going to go and grab some, and type up this analysis of source. At least get a good rough start. Again, we're going to do this essay basically for the rest of the year. Another thing I want you to consider is that although we can't write the entire essay, we can begin to construct a paragraph talking about related issue 1. Within related issue 1, we saw diversity and to what extent the world should protect diversity culturally is something that you could begin to put some ideas down on paper. So I'm going to go grab some Chromebooks so that you guys can get started on that, and that'll be how we finish the day.